Good afternoon and welcome to the Acreage and Grain Stocks Briefing. My name is Lance Honig and I am the chair of the Agricultural Statistics Board at NASS. This briefing is for the Secretary of Agriculture and other policymakers at USDA to better understand the content and context of today's reports. We are very pleased to have USDA's Deputy Secretary, Stephen Vaden, join us today. We also welcome Dr. Justin Benavidez, USDA's Chief Economist. Mr. Deputy Secretary, I'd like to share that we have a group of Demmer scholars joining us today. You can see them all around the room. So welcome to all of those folks as well today. Before I turn things over to our presenter, I do have a few notes for our live streaming audience. These reports are considered principal federal economic indicator reports. The Office of Management and Budget provides specific guidance on how these important reports are to be released. OMB statistical policy instructs policymaking officials to refrain from making public comment regarding the content of these reports within 30 minutes of their release. Therefore, we will not be taking questions from the public during this briefing. NASS staff are available for phone or email questions, and NASS will host a social media event at 1:30 Eastern Time this afternoon. We strive to have everything presented at this briefing match the official record. However, should there be any discrepancy, always refer to the official published estimates. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Anthony Perlman. He is the Associate Deputy Administrator for the Office of Analysis and Estimation here at NASS. Anthony?
All right, thanks, Lance, and good afternoon. I also want to welcome all those who have joined us here in the room today, as well as those joining online. I have a lot of information to go over today from our acreage, grain stocks, and rice stocks reports. So let's go ahead and just jump right into it. All right, let's first start by looking at the two surveys we conducted to establish the estimates. The first is our June agricultural survey, which is a farmer-reported survey. A sample size was nearly 90,300 with data collected between May 28th through June 19th. Now, I will point out that we increased the sample size by approximately 22,500 records this year compared to 2025 in order to increase the number of usable reports. Now, for this survey, farmers are asked to report the total acres they operate, acreage for each commodity of interest, as well as the amount of grain and rice they had stored on their farming operation as of June 1st. Now, the other survey we conducted was the all-farm grain stock survey, which accounts for all grain stored in commercial facilities. There are approximately 7,800 of those facilities across the country, and we collected data from them between May 29th and June 17th. And then the map on this slide shows how those June ag survey samples are distributed across the U.S. As you can see, the larger sample sizes represented by the darker shade of orange are in the major crop producing states. Now, on this slide, we are showing the percent of usable responses collected each day during the data collection window for the June Ag Survey and how 2026 compares with the previous 2 years. Now, as you can see, data collection this year was very similar to both 2025 and 2024. However, we did extend data collection a few more days this year. Now, as we have done the last several years, we are highlighting the amount of corn and soybean acres that were left to be planted when we were conducting the survey. Farmers reported that 1.9 million acres of corn and 8.05 million acres of soybeans were left to be planted during the time of data collection. Last year at this time, 3.63 million acres of corn and 11.5 million acres of soybeans remained to be planted. Now, we also added an additional paragraph this year documenting the historic reliability of the June estimates and provided a calculated range around today's corn and soybean estimates based on a 90% confidence interval that is based on 20 years of historic information. Now, before we start looking at the individual crops, so let's first look at the principal crops total to see that big picture of what's happening across all the crops this year. Now, this total is simply the sum of the 22 major crops that are listed in that blue box at the bottom of the slide. Now, based on our current estimates, the principal crops total for 2026 is estimated at 309.6 million acres. This is down just 0.1% or 312,000 acres from what was published back in the March prospective plantings report, and it's down 0.6% or 1.9 million acres from the previous season. Now, looking at the principal crop acres graphically across the past 10 seasons, you can see how the 2026 planted total compares historically. Now, this does represent the lowest total since 2019. And then as a reminder, NASS will not publish a principal crop harvested estimate until the end of the season. However, we will publish individual crops forecasts of harvested acreage throughout the growing season. All right, next we'll look at the principal crops total by state. I'll give a quick overview of how to read this map. Top number in each state represents the value as indicated in the title. For this map, that is the state's principal crops total for 2026. Bottom number represents the percent change from the previous estimate. This map is comparing back to March. States colored in blue are showing an increase from the previous estimate, whereas the states colored in red are showing a decrease. And then the darker the shade, the greater the percent change. Now, if you see a pound sign beside the top number, that represents a record high for that state, whereas an ampersand represents a record low. Comparing the principal crop totals back to March, we see small declines in many western states, but increases in many areas of the eastern U.S. All right, this map is laid out the same as the one we just looked at, but now we are comparing this year's principal crop totals to last year, so you can see those year-over-year changes. No record high principal crops totals are estimated in 2026, but record lows are estimated in California, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and South Carolina. All right, we'll now start looking at the individual crops, starting with corn. Now, this graphic shows how this year's planting progress compares to the previous 5 seasons. This data comes from our weekly crop progress and conditions survey, and 2026 is represented by the red line. Now, as this chart indicates, there was nothing abnormal with planting this year since conditions were fairly good in most areas of the U.S. this spring. All right, looking at the corn acreage numbers that were released today, planted acreage in 2026 is estimated at 95.3 million acres. That's up just 5,000 acres from the March intentions, but down 3.5% or 3.45 million acres from what was planted last year. Harvested acres for grain are forecasted 87.4 million acres. That is down 4.2% from 2025. And then that bottom table on this slide shows the top 5 states in terms of corn acreage for 2026 and how both planted and harvested acreage compare to last season. And then as a reminder, 1.9 million acres of that total planted estimate were reported as left to be planted during the time of data collection. All right, this chart is showing how the 2026 planted and harvested corn estimates compare to the previous 9 seasons. Now, even though planted acreage is down from a year ago, this year's total still represents the 4th highest U.S. planted area since 1944. All right, this map is comparing the current 2026 planted corn acreage estimates to the numbers released in March, and so you can see those changes by state. And this map is similar to the one we just looked at, but now we are comparing this year's planted area to the previous year. And as you can see, there is a lot of red on this map indicating a decline in acreage from last year. In fact, planted acreage is down or unchanged from last year in 40 of the 48 estimating states. However, record high corn planted acres are estimated in Nevada and Washington, whereas record lows are estimated in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. Now, today's report also includes estimates for the percent of corn planted using biotech seed. Now, as you can see on this chart, we don't see much change year over year. All right, let's now look at how today's corn planted estimate compares to pre-report industry expectations. As a reminder, each blue dot on the chart represents an individual industry member's published expectations of corn planted area, and the red square represents the NASS corn planted estimate of 95.3 million acres. And as you can see, the NASS forecast falls close to the middle of the range of expectations, so probably not much of a surprise with today's number. All right, moving on to soybeans. As we did for corn, now we wanted to show how this year's planting progress compares to the previous 5 seasons. Again, the dark line represents this year's planting pace. As you can see, planting ran ahead of the normal pace most of the spring, which again indicates good planting conditions overall. Now, looking at the soybean acreage numbers, in today's report, planted acreage for 2026 is estimated at nearly 85.4 million acres. This is up 0.8% or 665,000 acres from the March intentions, and up 5.1% or 4.15 million acres from the previous season. Harvested acreage is forecast at 84.4 million acres. That is up 4.9% from last year. And as we discussed earlier, 8.05 million acres of the estimated total planted area were left to be planted at the time we spoke to the farmers. All right, looking at soybean acres over time, you can see how this year's numbers compare to the previous 9 seasons. Now, looking at how the current state level soybean planted estimates compare to the March intentions, you see a lot of blue on this map indicating increased soybean plantings compared to the March intentions. And then looking at those year-over-year changes to soybeans, now, as you would expect, you see a lot of increases from last year due to the 5% increase in total U.S. planted acres. In fact, planted acreage is up or unchanged in 23 of the 29 estimating states. All right, we also published the percent of soybean acres planted using biotech seed. And as you can see, again, we see very little change year to year. All right, looking at how the soybean planted estimate compares to industry expectations, you can see that it too falls near the middle of the range. So probably not much of a surprise with today's number. All right, the next 2 maps will show the combined corn and soybean acreage by state for 2026 and how that compares to both the March intentions and last year. This first map is a comparison back to March. As you can see, the combined total of 180.7 million acres is at a record level and up 0.4% from the March intentions. And then here is those combined state totals compared to the previous season. I will point out we have record high corn and soybean combined acreage in Kansas, Nebraska, Nevada, North Dakota, and Washington, and record lows in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. And then real quickly looking at the combined acreage total and how that compares to industry expectations, you can see that it too falls within the range. All right, looking at U.S. cotton acres, planted acreage is estimated at 9.85 million in 2026. This is up 2.2% or 210,000 acres from the March intentions, and up 6.1% or 567,500 acres from last season. Now, as a reminder, we will publish our first forecast of 2026 harvested acres for cotton in the August crop production report. Looking at cotton acreage over time, you can see how this year's planted acreage compares to previous seasons. I will point out that even though the 2026 planted area is up compared to the previous year, it still represents the second lowest level since 2015. All right, looking at cotton planted acreage by state compared with the March intentions, you will see that 8 states are up compared to those intentions, with the biggest increase in Mississippi, which was up 130,000 acres. 4 states decreased, including Texas, which was down 95,000 acres from the March intentions, and 5 states showed no change from March. And then looking at the year-over-year changes, you will see increases in 12 of the 17 estimating states. I'll also point out that you'll see some fairly large increases in most of the southeastern states. This was mainly due to a reduction in peanut acreage this year. And then we also published the percent of upland cotton acreage that was planted with biotech seed. Now, today's cotton planted estimate is within the range of expectations, but is higher than most had anticipated. All right, let's now look at U.S. wheat acreage. We'll start with winter wheat. Planted area at 31.5 million acres is down 2.7% or 890,000 acres from the March estimate. The June planted acreage estimate was based on all available data, including current FSA certified acreage. Planted acres are down 4.9% or 1.63 million acres from the previous season. Harvested acreage at 21.2 million was lowered 3.7% or 805,000 acres from the previous forecast and is down 16.8% or 4.3 million acres from the previous season. Now, looking at winter wheat acreage across time, you can see how it compares to the previous 9 seasons. I will also note the large difference between the planted and the harvested total this season, indicating a higher percentage of acreage is forecast to not be harvested for grain this year due to the adverse weather conditions experienced in many of the large winter wheat producing states this year. And then the harvested area at 21.2 million acres represents a record low for the U.S. All right, comparing the current planted estimates to what we published in March, you see declines or no changes in all estimating states except Idaho. This map is showing those year-over-year changes in winter wheat planted area. And as you can see, the majority of the states are down from 2025. Also point out that record low winter wheat acreage is estimated in California, Nebraska, and Virginia in 2026. All right, today's winter wheat planted estimate does look to be a surprise with the NASS estimate falling below the range of expectations. All right, moving on to other spring wheat. Planted area at 9.39 million acres is down 0.3% or 25,000 acres from the March intentions, and down 6% or 600,000 acres from the 2025 season. A harvested area at nearly 9.1 million acres is down 5.6% from last year. Looking at this year's numbers compared to the previous 9 seasons, you can see they are the lowest in the series and continues the overall decline we have seen going back to 2018. And this does represent the lowest planted acreage in the U.S. since 1970. All right, this map is comparing the current planted estimates to those March intentions. And then looking at those year-over-year changes, all states are down except for Montana. I will point out too that record low acreage is estimated in South Dakota this year. All right, today's other spring wheat planted estimate does fall within the range of expectations. All right, turning our focus to durum. Planted area at 1.83 million acres is down 6.2% or 120,000 acres from the March intentions, and down 16.2% or 355,000 acres from the 2025 season. Harvested acreage at nearly 1.78 million is down 16.3% from last year. And then looking at durum wheat acres over time, you can see how 2026 compares to previous years. Then here's how those current planted estimates compare to the March intentions and how they compare to the previous year. Today's durum estimate looks to be a surprise, falling below the range of expectations. All right, we do have quite a few other crops in the report, and I'll move through these fairly quickly. Barley planted acreage is up 5.9% for the previous year, while harvested area is up 6.4%. Canola planted and harvested acreage are up nearly 27% from last year, and both represent record highs for the U.S. Acreage in both North Dakota, which is the largest canola producing state, and Washington represent record highs for those 2 states. Chickpea planted area at 482,000 is down 10.1% from last year. Dry edible bean acreage is down 15% from last year, while planted acreage of dry edible peas is down nearly 11%. Flaxseed planted acres are up 23% in 2026 compared to the previous year. Alfalfa hay harvested acres are up 1/10% from 2025. However, California is expecting a record low harvested area this year. Other hay harvested acres are up 0.6% from last year. A record high harvested area is expected in Alaska, while record lows are expected in California, Illinois, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Ohio, and Oregon. Lentils planted area is down 30.3% from the previous season. I will point out that in 2026, the Montana planted acreage represents 83% of U.S. total planted acres, and then planted acreage for mustard seed is estimated to be up 4.2% from last year. Oat planted acreage is estimated to be up 2.3% from last year, but still represents the third lowest level on record. A record low planted acreage is estimated in Maine, Michigan, and Oregon. Peanut planted acreage at 1.53 million is down nearly 22%, or 425,000 acres from last year. This does follow record high U.S. peanut production in 2025. Potato planted acreage at 873,000 acres is down 3.2% from the previous season, while harvested area is down 3.3%. Both planted and harvested area represent a record low for the U.S. Proso millet acreage is estimated to be up 13.1% this year. Rapeseed planted area is up 2.2% from the previous year. U.S. planted rice acreage at nearly 2.02 million acres is down 28.3% from last year, and this represents the lowest planted area in the U.S. since 1972. Planted rye acres at 2.38 million are up 6.8% from last year, while harvested acres for grain are down 8.5%. However, keep in mind that much of the planted area for this crop is used as a cover crop or feed, so it's not surprising to see planted and harvested areas moving in different directions year over year. Safflower acreage is up 7.3% compared to last year. Sorghum planted area at 6.2 million acres is down 5.4% from last year, while harvested acreage is forecast to be down 8.9%. Both planted and harvested sugar beet acreage are down over 4% from the previous season. I do want to point out that record low plantings are estimated in Nebraska this year. Sugarcane harvested acreage is up 1.1% from 2025. Harvested acreage in Louisiana is estimated at a record high. Planted sunflower acreage at nearly 1.35 million acres is up 4.6% from 2025. And then lastly, looking at tobacco, harvested acreage is estimated to be up 0.5% from the previous season. All right, these next few slides gives you an overview of what we have discussed today and how it all fits together. This first slide shows those 22 principal crops sorted from largest to smallest acreage, so you can see how they compare with each other. This next chart is showing the acreage changes from the March intentions. The data is sorted from the largest increases, which are at the top of the chart, to the largest decreases at the bottom. This next chart is comparing acreage to the previous year as a percentage. Again, we are sorting it by the largest percent increase to the largest percent decrease. And this is the last slide we have on acreage today. It's similar to the slide we just looked at, but now we are showing the actual acreage change from 2025 instead of a percent change. All right, let's now transition over to the stock estimates that we released today. We'll start with all wheat stocks. Now, as a reminder, June represents the ending stocks for wheat and the other small grains. As of June 1st, all wheat stocks totaled just over 920 million bushels. This was up 7.6% from the same time last year. On-farm stocks were down 3.7% year over year, while the off-farm portion was up 10.8%. All right, this graphic provides a visual of what's happening with the crop over the marketing season. The blue vertical bars represent the beginning supply for each crop year. The 4 horizontal lines represent the 4 quarterly stock estimates we published during the season. And then the gold bar there at the bottom represents the June quarter. Now looking at the 25-26 beginning supply of 2.84 billion bushels, that was up 6.1% from the previous season. And then the March to May disappearance of 383 million bushels, up 0.3% from the same time period a year ago. All right, today's June 1st all wheat stock estimates is within the range of expectations, but lower than most had anticipated. All right, next we'll look at the June corn stocks, which represents the 3rd quarter stocks for this crop. As of June 1st, total stocks were estimated at 5.29 billion bushels. This was up 14% from the same time last year. On-farm stocks were up 15.8% from the previous June, while off-farm stocks were up 11.9%. This chart is similar to the one we just looked at for wheat, with the gold line representing June 1st. Beginning supply of corn for the 25-26 crop year was 18.6 billion bushels. That was up 11.5% from the 24-25 season. And then the March to May disappearance of 3.74 billion bushels was up 6.6% from the same time period a year earlier. All right, today's corn stock estimates falls just below the range of expectations, so it looks to be somewhat of a surprise. All right, next we'll look at June soybean stocks, which like corn represents the 3rd quarter of the marketing year. As of June 1st, total stocks were estimated at 1.06 billion bushels. That is up 5.3% from the same time last year. On-farm stocks were down 10.9% from last June, while off-farm stocks were up 16.5%. Now, the beginning supply of soybeans for the 25-26 crop year at 4.59 billion bushels were down 2.8% from the prior season. And then the March to May disappearance of 1.06 billion bushels was up 17.6% from the same period last year. And then today's soybean stock estimates does fall within the range of published expectations. Now, we also released the June rice stocks report today, which shows June 1 rough rice stocks totaling 74.8 million hundredweight. That is up 7.3% from a year earlier. On-farm stocks were up 20.1% from the previous June, while all-farm stocks were up 5%. The beginning supply of rice for the 25-26 season totaled 251 million hundredweight, 1.6% lower than the previous season. And then the March to May disappearance of 29.2 million hundredweight was down 6.9% from the same period last year. All right, looking at some of the other commodities in today's grain stocks report, June 1 barley stocks at 66.4 million bushels were down 4.3% from the same time last year. Canola stocks were up 4.9% from last June. Chickpea stocks were up 40.3% from the same time last year. Dry edible pea stocks were up 18.9%. Flaxseed stocks were up 108.5% from the same time last year. Lentil stocks were up 93.6% from last June. June 1 oat stocks at 31.8 million bushels were up 12.1% from the previous year. Rice stocks were up 11.3%. Sorghum stocks at 66.7 million bushels were down 33.1% from a year earlier. And lastly, durum wheat stocks at 33.5 million bushels were up 20.1% from the previous year. All right, this slide just highlights a few of the upcoming reports we'll be releasing in July. Tomorrow we'll be releasing our CARES report. On July 10th will be our next crop production. July 24th, cattle and cattle on feed. And we will wrap up the month on July 31st with the next agricultural prices report. As mentioned earlier, Lance will be on X at 1:30 today for Stat Chat, fielding any questions about the estimates in today's reports. So this concludes today's briefing. As a reminder, today's reports and all NASS reports and data can be found on our website. So again, I want to thank everyone who joined us here in the room today, as well as those who joined online. Have a good day.